Okay, welcome everyone to another week of Nishmat's Faith in a World of Turmoil series. We are very privileged this week to hear from Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg, who lives in Adam and has 5 children. She has both academic and yeshivish backgrounds, studying at Lindenbaum, Migdal Oz, and Matan, with a BA in Bible from the Hebrew University and an MA and PhD from Bar Ilan in Talmud. She teaches at Nishmat and Matan and Ephrata College. And she actually teaches the highest level class at Nishmat to our 3rd year and above students. And one of her students got engaged today. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the reins over to Rabbanit Adina. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to mute everyone for now. And if you have a question, please unmute yourself and participate.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm Adina. I'm pleased to meet you. And we're going to talk, the title is, how does Brit Ben HaBetarim help understand chaos? But it's not just going to be about Brit Ben HaBetarim, but more, or the connection between Brit Ben HaBetarim and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, etc. So actually this whole class started from Leila Seder as we were sitting at home during Corona times without our extended family, just us and our children, which we actually enjoy very much, but it was still very, very different from what people were used to doing. And while talking about all the messages and ideas of Yetziat Mitzrayim and all the things that were important for us to tell our kids about Yetziat Mitzrayim, I also thought to myself, what do I, as an adult living in our times, what do I want to take from this story? And not only in our times in the 21st century, but in our times in coronavirus times. What ideas, what concepts, what messages do I want to take for our times? So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the story of Exodus. Eventually we'll get to Brit Ben HaBetarim, but we're going to go back to the story of Exodus and ask ourselves what messages and what ideas can we take from this story to our times. So I have made a PowerPoint presentation so that the sources can be right before you. So I will share that. Okay. 1 second. Okay, so here we are. How does Brit Ben HaBetarim help understand chaos? In general, we're in very chaotic times, and we're trying to understand what's going on with us and how we can understand present times using the ideas of the Tanakh. So when I ask myself in general, just as a general question, as a theoretical question, what does the story of Exodus teach us? What did it come to teach us? What does it come to give for future generations? So the truth is, I think that one of the major things that the story of the Exodus comes to teach us is theology. What are our religious truths about God, about his connection to the world? And I think, somebody want to say something? Okay, and I think that this is something that Nechama Leibovich has in one of her studies. Talks in general about the theological idea of Makot Mitzrayim, of the plagues, of the whole Exodus story is teaching us about the presence of God. As we have in the Psukim, I'll read them in Hebrew and I'll roughly translate, but you have the translations right here in front of you. ויאמר השם אל משה, ראה נתתיך אלוהים לפרעה ואהרון אחיך יהיה נביא. Okay, so God says, whoever's not muted, please mute, unless you want to share with everybody. So Hashem says to Moshe, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron is going to be your prophet. אתה תצווה את כל אשר אצווך, ואהרון אחיך ידבר אל פרעה, ושלח את בני ישראל מארצו. ואני אקשה את לב פרעה, והרביתי את אותותיי ואת מופתיי בארץ מצרים, ולא ישמע לכם פרעה, ונתתי את ידי במצרים, והוצאתי את צבאותיי, את עמי בני ישראל מארץ מצרים, בשבטים גדולים. So when Hashem is telling Moshe about the general idea of what's going to happen, so Moshe and Aaron are going to be sent to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is going to harden his heart until we get shvatim gdolim. We get these big chastisements. Veyadu Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. Why do we have all of this? So that the Egyptians know that I am God, I am the Lord. Bintoti et yadi al Mitzrayim v'hotzeti et bnei Yisrael mitocham. So all the plagues are in order for, first of all, Egypt, and later on also the people of Israel to know and recognize God. And we see that in many of the plagues. We see that in the blood. כה אמר השם בזאת תדע כי אני השם, הנה אנוכי מכה במתי אשר בידי על המים אשר ביאור ונהפכו לדם. So when I slay the water, I put my hand on the water, it's going to turn into blood, and that's how we'll know כי אני השם. And later, when we have the frogs, ויאמר משה לפרעה, התפאר עלי למתי אתיר לך ולעבדיך ולעמך להכרית הצפרדעים ממך ומבתיך רק ביאור תשארנה, ויאמר למחר, ויאמר כדברך למען תדע כי אין כהשם אלוהינו. So when Moshe asks Pharaoh, when do you want me to get rid of the frogs? He says, I want tomorrow. He says, okay, tomorrow is, because so that you know that there is none like the Lord our God. It's not from now to now. He can plan ahead, etc. We have that again with Arov. והפלאתי ביום ההוא את ארץ גושן אשר עמי עומד עליה לבלתי היות שם הרוב למען תדע כי אני השם בקרב הארץ. Not only is there a God and he can do whatever he wants, he can also differentiate here in the land between the Israelites and the Egyptians. He can know that God is in the midst of the land. He actually sees what's going on here. Not only that he has the power to do things, but he can also differentiate. And we have that again in the Barad, כי בפעם הזאת אני שולח את כל מגפותיי אל לבך ובעבדיך ובעמך, בעבור תדע כי אין כמוני בכל הארץ, right? There is none like me in the world. And later on also, ויאמר אליו משה, כצאתי את העיר אפרוס את כפיי אל השם, הקולות יחדלון והברד לא יהיה עוד, למען תדע כי להשם הארץ. It's everything this is, when Moshe is going to stop the Barad, the hell, it's so that you may know that the earth is the Lord. So we have all kinds of different, throughout the different plagues. Later we also have it with other plagues. We have it with the Arbe, we have it with Bechorot. We need to know, this is so that we know that God is here. As we say, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. He sees, he can do. And even when we have the story of breaking the waters of the Red Sea, again, Ve'edu Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. Yes, is there someone who wants to ask? Okay, so anyway, one very big part of Yetziat Mitzrayim is a theological concept that we learn from here. The Malbim sums it up. ויאמר השם אל משה, המכות נחלקו לשלושה סדרים. Okay, so the plagues are in 3 sets. כמו שכתוב, רבי יהודה היה נותן בהם סימנים, דצה חדש באחר. We know that Rabbi Yehuda would give us like signs. It's not only what we call ראשי תיבות, right? ד' צד כ' is דם צפרדע קינים, but it gives us 3 separate sets, דצה חדש באחר, ומכה אחרונה, שהיא מכת בכורות, היא חוץ מן הסדרים. The last one is not part of these sets. כי תכליתה היה שישלח את ישראל. The purpose of בכורות was to let the people out of Egypt. ואז נתרצה לשלחם, and that's when he let them out. אבל 9 הראשונות לא היה תכליתם לשלח את ישראל. The first 9, their purpose was not to let the people out of Egypt, because God could have brought the last one and everybody would have gone out. Not only that, כי השם חיזק את ליבו שלא יובל לשלחם. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So obviously it's not so that he lets them out, because if he wanted Pharaoh to let them out, he wouldn't have hardened his heart. רק היה תכליתם להודיע לכל העולם שיש אלוה, ושהוא משגיח על העולם, ושהוא בא ליכולת מאין כמוהו. So we need to know that there's a God, that he sees what's going on, right? There's divine providence. He can see what's going on, and of course that he has all the power in the world, what others don't have. So that's the first part of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the theological. I think in times like now, when there's a lot of chaos, and we don't always know what's going to happen, and where we're going, and what's going to be, and there's a certain feeling of getting lost, a lot of us go back to these theological concepts and remind ourselves, God is here, he sees what's going on, he's omnipotent, he can do whatever he wants like no other. It doesn't always help us because then we ask ourselves, okay, so why is this happening? But there's something in this knowledge that gives us a lot of security and a certain base to follow on. Before we continue to the actually sense of insecurity, I want to go to the next thing that I find very important, a very important message of the Exodus story, which isn't 100% relevant to the times of chaos and turmoil, but I think it is important when we're dealing with this chaos and a lot of the ramifications of this chaos and turmoil. And that is something that comes up in the negotiation between Moshe and Paro. The 10 plagues give us a long time to negotiate. And when we negotiate, one of the things that we find out are what are people's beliefs? What are the things that they take for granted? What are the things that they see as obvious? And even though the negotiation specifically is whether or not people of Israel are going to leave Egypt, we find a lot of religious concepts and ideas coming up through this negotiation. So we're going to start from what happens right after Arov. ויקרא פרעה אל משה ולאהרון, ויאמר לכו זבחו לאלוהיכם בארץ. You know what? Fine. How about you've been asking to sacrifice? Sacrifice. How about you sacrifice right here in the land of Egypt? ויאמר משה לא נכון לעשות כן, כי תועבת מצרים נזבח להשם אלוקינו, הנזבח את תועבת מצרים לעיניהם ולא יסכלונו. So Moshe says it's not right to do this. For what we sacrifice to our God is untouchable to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice that which is untouchable to the Egyptians before their very eyes, will they not stone us? We can't do that. By the way, little secret, they did that in Korban Pesach a few chapters later, but that will keep our little secret. דרך 3 ימים נלך במדבר, וזבחנו להשם אלוקינו כאשר יאמר אלינו, ויאמר פרעה אנוכי אשלח אתכם, וזבחתם להשם אלוהיכם במדבר, רק הרחק לא תרחיקו ללכת, העתירו בעדי. So the first thing that comes up in the negotiation between Moshe and Paro, it comes up pretty late in our story, is that Paro has this idea, you know what? Why don't you sacrifice right over here? You've been asking to sacrifice to your God. You want to worship your God. What's the problem with doing it in Egypt? And Moshe tells him, no, we can't do that. We can't do it in Egypt. This is untouchable for the Egyptians. Now, the cynical people here might say to themselves, well, we all know this is a bluff, right? We know that the real reason why Moshe didn't want to come out to sacrifice in Egypt was because he wanted to leave Egypt. But I still think this is an important thing, because what Pharaoh is saying, that you can sacrifice wherever you want. And Moshe is telling him it doesn't work that way. We have to have a certain distance. And I think a lot of the people here reading these psukim might remember Derech Shloshet Yamim from somewhere else. Might remember Derech Shloshet Yamim from the story of the Akedah, right? Where Avram is asked to go 3 days. He walks 3 days to find the right place to sacrifice. Let's go to the next part in the negotiation. Where do we have this? We have this in the story of the Arbe. Vayomru avdei Pharaoh elav, okay? Moshe just warned that there's going to be Arbe. ויאמרו עבדי פרעה אליו, עד מתי יהיה זה לנו למוקש? שלח את האנשים ויעבדו את השם אלוהיהם. הטרם תדע כי עבדה מצרים? So far as couriers say to him, how long are you going to wait? Why don't you just let them go? Don't you know that where Egypt is lost? ויושב את משה ואת אהרון אל פרעה, ויאמר עליהם, לכו עבדו את השם אלוהיכם, מי ומי הולכים. You know what? Fine, you want to go? Let's talk about who. Let's talk numbers. Let's talk about the people. ויאמר משה בנערינו וזקנינו נלך, בבנינו, בבנותינו, בצורנינו, בבקרינו נלך, כי חג השם לנו. And Moshe says, everybody, we're all going together. The elderly and the young, the women and the men, the children, everyone together. ויאמר להם, יהי כן השם עמכם כאשר אשלח אתכם ואת אפכם, ראו כי רעה נגד פניכם. So Pharaoh says, no problem, the Lord will be with you, the same as I mean. So he's saying, I'm not quite sure that you need the children for God to be with you. I know that what you're asking is actually not a good thing. Lochem. Let's go say differently, not go that way. לכו נא הגברים ועבדו את השם, כי אותה אתם מבקשים, ויגרש אותם מאת מצרו. So Pharaoh is saying, you asking to go with all the children and the women, something here is fishy. You should take only the men and go, and that should be okay.
If you want to fix that,
a second thing that comes up. That's a second thing that comes up in the negotiation, and we'll get back to that in a second. And the third thing comes up around the plague of right after חושך. ויקרא פרעה אל משה ויאמר לכו עבדו את השם, רק צונכם ובקרכם יוצג, גם טפכם ילך עמכם. You know what? Fine, you can go. Even take your children, but leave here the animals. You don't need to take all the animals. Take whatever you decide to give to your God, and the rest you can leave here. ויאמר משה, גם אתה תיתן בידינו זבחים ועולות, ועשינו להשם אלוקינו. No. Not only will we take our cattle and sheep and everything, you are going to provide us with sacrifices. וגם מקננו ילך עמנו, לא תישאר פרסה, כי ממנו ניקח לעבוד את השם אלוקינו, ואנחנו לא נדע מה נעבוד את השם עד בואנו שמה. So here we have three arguments, or 3 points of argument between Moshe and Pharaoh. What is Pharaoh telling Moshe? Pharaoh is saying, you know what? You want to go sacrifice? Take your men. Take whatever sheep and cattle you decide you need to sacrifice. And the truth is, you can even do it over here. And Moshe says, no, it doesn't work that way. We're going to go everyone together. We're going to take whatever sheep and cattle we can find, and we're going away 3 days distance. Why is this important? Because I think that Pharaoh here is saying something that is really very logical. First of all, he's saying Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, right? Didn't you just tell us, Ani Hashem bekerev haaretz? Well, if God is right here amongst us in the land, you can sacrifice right over here in my land. God has just shown himself here. Why don't you sacrifice him here? That's one thing he's saying. He's also saying, you can choose whatever you give God, right? We people worship God. And the third thing he's saying, most important, is you really know between me and you.
Well, yeah, because you had it on mute.
Okay. Someone doesn't have it on mute. What do we really know here? We know that religion is a man thing, right? We all know that. You know that. We know that. Pharaoh is saying, what's this ridiculous idea of bringing your children to sacrifice? What is this ridiculous idea to think that your women are part of your religion? We know that religion is for men. You know, I have a friend who grew up in a family here in Israel, and in her family, the men are Shomer Shabbos and the women aren't, because religion is for men, not for women. So that's what Pharaoh is saying. Yeah, right. Nowadays, I think one of the big controversies, at least here in Israel and a lot of the communities, now that we've opened up the shuls again, should it be open only to men, or should women also be allowed to come? If we're counting heads, are we counting heads of women or only counting heads of men? Are women part of Avodat Hashem, or are women supposed to stay home while the men go off and sacrifice? So one of the things that we learn here in the Exodus story is that everyone is part of Avodat Hashem. Even though Pharaoh thinks that Avodat Hashem is for men, what Moshe is telling him, no way. Avodat Hashem is something for the whole community. It's something for the whole people. It is true that our Torah also distinguishes between men and women. We're not saying that they don't. But as a general principle, worshiping God is for the whole nation together. And we'll figure out the way how to do it. And the main thing that Moshe is saying is that we don't decide how we worship God. God decides how we're going to worship him. He decides on the place. He decides on the time. He decides what, and we just go and do that. So And this is, of course, as opposed to Pharaoh, who makes up the religion as he goes. It's a male religion, and you can decide where and when you want to do it. This brings us back to the Akedah, where Avram says to Yitzchak, Hashem yireh lo aseh le'olad mi. He's going to pick the sacrifice. He gets to pick, not us. So up till now, I think there are two general, very important theological and religious ideas that we learn from the story of Exodus. Right? One of them is theology. Where is God? What he can do? His presence in this world. And the other one deals with religion. What does our religion consist of? And it consists of a community, a nation as a whole, worshiping God in his terms, not on our terms, on his terms. What he decides and where he decides, that's what we do. Of course, there's another very important religious concept that we learn from Exodus, and that is the idea of memory. Hey, you should explain to your son, it is because of what the Lord did for me that I went free from Egypt. So you're going to have all these reminders to remember what God did for us, meaning our theology is being reenacted again and again and again so that we remember it. Part of our religion is to remember our theology. Part of our religion is to remember and pass on to future generations. But now we get to what I find as a most important part, or most actually curious or even problematic, confusing part of the story of Exodus. And that is that when we look at the story of Exodus, I think another very important concept that comes up is a concept of reward and punishment. If you think about the 10 plagues, and in general, all the punishments and all the hardships that the Egyptian got throughout the story of Exodus, I think we just get this very big idea of punishment for the people who did wrong. If you think about the 10 plagues, think about how blood is so logical. If you're throwing our babies into the Nile, it's not very surprising that the Nile becomes full of blood. And if the Nile becomes full of blood, then it's not surprising that frogs come jumping out of it. And if you bury our people amongst the land is going to start shaking under your feet with lice and with animals and all kinds of other explanations of the law. So, and if you're using our people as if they were cattle, so your cattle is going to die. We have so many things in the Makot themselves, in the plagues, that we can say to ourselves, the Egyptians are getting what they deserved. They were the bad guys, and they are now being punished. And another religious and theological idea that we have here is that those who are bad get punished. God sees what's going on in the land, and he rewards the good and punishes the bad. However, here's where things become confusing. Why? Because when I think about the Egyptians getting punished for what they did, I start asking myself, what about the people of Israel who suffered for so long? What did they do wrong? What was it that caused the Israelite people to get 200 or 400, however many years we explain it, of years of slavery and of hardship and of having their babies killed? The story of Egypt, we like to remember the good parts, but God tells us we need to remember the maror too. So I want to know, where did that maror come from? Now, what did Bnei Israel do wrong that they had to suffer so much? And I think the question becomes harder when we think about our days. You walk around, we have Corona on every street corner, and people are trying to understand Why is it that we have this Quran? After we said Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, he can do whatever he wants, he sees what's going on in the land. So then the obvious question is, so why did God bring us the Quran? And then you start hearing all kinds of rabbis and all kinds of theologians and all kinds of people on every street corner saying, I'll tell you what you did wrong, which is why we now have coronavirus, right? We can tell you. By the way, it's usually things people already thought beforehand that were wrong, that other people were doing wrong. And then they say, it's because of, and you can give any number of answers. It's because we're too material. It's because we're too communal. It's because we don't pay enough attention to our kids. So now God said you sit with your kids at home and think very well about what you did. It's because you didn't make aliyah. It's because you're not religious enough. It's because everybody has a good reason to say what other people are doing wrong, and that's why God brought us coronavirus, right? And so you say, okay, if God brings us some kind of plague, we need to ask ourselves, what did we do wrong that we deserve this plague? And then you go back to the story of Egypt, and you go back to Exodus, and you say to yourself, okay, so what did they do wrong? Why did Bnei Israel deserve to be so many years slaving away and having their kids taken away from them? And the question becomes bigger when you see that it was actually preordained. And this is where we get to Brit Ben Abtalim, right? Avraham Avinu was told 400 or 200 years ahead of time, right? 400 years ahead of time, that his children and grandchildren and his later generations are going to be enslaved and oppressed. ויאמר אליו, אני השם אשר הוצאתיך מאור כשדים, לתת לך את הארץ הזאת לרשתה. ויאמר לאברהם, ידוע תדע כי גר יהיה זרעך בארץ עולהם, ועבדום ועינו אותם 400 שנה. You should know that your offsprings will be strangers in the land not theirs. They should be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. וגם את הגוי אשר יעבודו דן אנוכי, ואחרי כן יצאו ברכוש גדול. I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. ואתה תבוא אל אבותיך בשלום, תיקבר בשיבה טובה. Okay, you shall go to your fathers in peace, be buried at a ripe old age. ודור רביעי ישובו הנה, כי לא שלם עוון האמורי עליהנה. They shall return here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites are not yet complete. Wonderful. So what do we hear at Brit Ben Abtalim? We hear that this is going to happen. Do we know why? Does it tell us why the people of Israel are going to be enslaved so many years? Does it give any reasoning that has to do with our regular concepts of reward and punishment, of crime and punishment? As we were sitting on the Seder and discussing the song that we all like to sing, Vehi she'amda לאבותינו ולנו, שלא אחד בלבד עמד עלינו לכלותנו, והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם. Isn't it wonderful to remind us again and again of the heavenly promise to take care of us? And whenever anyone comes up against us, God will save us. However, as we noticed, talking about it at the Seder, there's also a promise that again and again people are going to come up against us. And God is saving us from a problem that he put us into. We're thanking God so much at Leila Seder for taking us out of Egypt after he told us that he's going to put us in there. So are we supposed to say thank you for God giving us all this trouble just so that he could take us out again? And again, it's not even clear why he's doing that. Why was it so important to tell us to do this? Why did we deserve this? Did we deserve this? So, we do have, one second, before I answer that, the story of Brit Ben Abtalim also raises a question about reward and punishment for the Egyptians. As we see, the verses tell us that the Egyptians themselves, not that it doesn't tell us about the Egyptians, but the story tells us that God is promising us to be enslaved and promising later to punish those who enslave us. But why are they punished? God said that they're going to do that. They're just playing a role in the play that God wrote, right? Why should they be punished? So there are a few answers. One, Egyptians were the ones who volunteered, so they're the ones who get to be punished. But we also have in Zechariah says about the Babylonians. He says this, ויאמר עלי המלאך הדובר בי, קרא לאמור, כה אמר השם צבאות, קינאתי לירושלים ולציון קנאה גדולה. So the angel who talked to Zechariah, he says, you should tell us, thus said the Lord of hosts, I am jealous for Jerusalem, for Zion, וקצף גדול אני קוצף על הגויים השאננים, אשר אני קצפתי מעט והם עזרו לרעה. And you know what? I am very angry with those nations that are at ease. For I was only angry a little, but they overdid the punishment. There's here something that I should have erased. I'm sorry. Okay, so what is Zechariah saying? Zechariah is saying is God promised us a punishment or some kind of hardship. But those Gentiles, they like to add to the fire. They did much more than they were requested, and therefore they're going to be punished. Yeshayahu gives a different answer. He says that because those who punish us aren't aware of them playing a role, and they think that they are the ones who decide, and they think they are better than everyone else. They think they are better than God, then God will show them that they're not, that they are only being a tool being used in his hand. And we'll read a few of the verses here. Hoi ashur shevet api, umatehu beyadam za'ami. Ha, Assyria, you are my rod of anger, the rod of my anger, in whose hand, as a staff is my fury. You're being used as my staff. בגוי חנפה שלחנו ועל עם עברתי יצבנו, לשלול שלל ולבוז בז, ולשומו מרמס כחומר חוצות. I send him against an ungodly nation. I charge him against the people that provokes me, to take its spoil and seize its booty, and make it a thing trampled like the mire of the streets. Well, we have a lot of hard words here. והוא לא כן ידמה, ולבבו לא כן יחשוב, כי להשמיד בלבבו, ולהחריט גויים לא מעט. The Assyrians didn't see themselves as a rod of God's anger. They harbored evil designs. They wanted to destroy, to wipe out. They wanted to punish. I'm skipping here to verse 14. היתפאר הגרזן על החוצב בו, אם יתגדל המסור על מניפו, כהנפשבת ואת מרימיו, כהרים מטה לו עץ. Does an axe boast over him who hews with it, or a saw magnify itself above him who wields it, as though the rod raises him who lifts it, as though the staff lifted the man? Meaning the Assyrians were supposed to be the vessels that God uses to punish us, but they thought they were better than God. They didn't see themselves as a tool. They saw themselves as acting up against God, and therefore they deserve punishment. So if we go back to our question, I want to clarify what bugs me, or what haunts me, or what caught my attention. What caught my attention is that we're used to this, you might say, childish view of the world, that the world works in a way of crime and punishment and doing good deeds and getting reward. And when we see the story of the plagues, we say to ourselves, yeah, the Egyptians deserved it. They were bad and they deserved to get punished. But then we grow up a little bit and we ask ourselves, but why did we get punished? We're being promised a punishment without even being told why. So how does this help us deal with the world and with bad things that happen to us in the world? When I'm trying to think to myself, okay, so now there's this whole thing going on in the world, this coronavirus that's taking over the world, and a lot of hardship is happening due to it. Also a lot of good things, but many people are dying, are sick, are losing their jobs. So many bad things are happening. And I go back to the sources and I ask myself, how do I deal with this? So lots of people will go back to the sources and say, crime and punishment, let's go look for our crimes. But if we go back a little bit more, we go back to the story of Brit Ben Abetarim. Brit Ben Abetarim is not giving us any crime to justify the punishment, any crime to justify the hardship. Now, there is one opinion, the Ramban's opinion, who gives it a justification. He explains why, sort of, we have the hardship of Egypt. So let's see what he says. He says this when Abraham himself goes down to Egypt right after he makes Aliyah. My parents were once in shul with someone who explained to us when we came to visit them in America, when they were once in America. The guy in the shul said, you know what, making Aliyah is really easy. I've done it a few times. So Avraham Avinu also made Aliyah a few times. He made Aliyah right afterwards. He went down to Egypt, made Aliyah again, came back to Israel again. So now the Ramban talks about going down to Egypt. And he says this, Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz. Hine Avraham yarad lemitzrayim, mipnei hara'av, lagur sham, le'achayot nafsho b'imei habatzorot. Okay, so notice Avraham goes down to Egypt in order to, due to the hunger, in order to save his life in the days of drought. And notice what did the Egyptians do to him? They exploited him. They took away his wife for no reason. So God avenged him with great afflictions. Okay, and then they came out of Egypt with a lot of cattle and silver and gold. And Paro even commanded men to send him. והמצרים יראו להם ויקחו מהם הנשים, כאשר אמר בכל הבת חיון. והקדוש ברוך הוא ינקום נקמתם בנגעים גדולים, עד שיוציאם בכסף וזהב וצאן ובקר, מקנה כבד מאוד, והחזיקו בהם לשלחה מן הארץ. Notice that everything that happened to Avraham Avinu happened to the people of Israel. They went down to Egypt because of the famine. The Egyptians were not nice to them. They took their women. That's how the Ramban explains why you kill the boys and you let the girls live, so that afterwards the girls become their slaves for whatever uses they want. And in the end, God afflicted, brought the revenge, and the people of Israel came out with a lot of gold and silver and cattle, etc. But now the Ramban gives an explanation. Veda, ki Avraham Avinu chata chet gadol bishgada, שהביא אשתו הצדקת במכשול עוון, מפני פחדו פן יהרגו. You should know that our father Abraham committed a great sin unintentionally. Why? Because he brought his righteous wife to stumble into transgression because of his fear of getting killed. He let them exploit her. They let him take her because he was scared. והיה לו לבטוח בשם שיציל אותו ואת אשתו ואת כל אשר לו. כי יש באלוהים כוח לעזור ולהציל. The Ramban should have trusted God and not let the Egyptians take his wife. גם יציאתו מן הארץ שנצטווה עליו בתחילה מפני הרעב עוון אשר חטא. Also leaving the land that he was commanded to go to because of the famine, leaving the land of Israel was also a sin. כי אלוהים ברעב יפדנו ממוות. God just promised him, just told him to go to the land of Israel. And now he's leaving already? He should have trusted God. He should have had faith that God will make sure that he has food to eat. ועל המעשה הזה נגזר על זרעו הגלות בארץ מצרים ביד פרעה. במקום המשפט שמה הרשע והחטא. The Ramban says here a very harsh thing. He says, the fact that the people of Israel went down to Egypt and suffered all these hardships are all Avraham Avinu's fault. He did not trust God enough to stay in the land of Israel after promised, after commanded to go to the land of Israel. That was wrong. That was a sin. It was unintentional, but it was a great sin. And because of that sin, the people of Israel go through all the hardships. So on one hand, there's something comforting about this Ramban, because he says you can't find a punishment without finding a sin. If you see something bad going on in the world, go look for the sin that preceded it. So on one hand, it's comforting. On the other hand, it's really disconcerting. On the other hand, what? You mean the people of Israel suffered so much because something their forefather did 400 years ago or 200 years ago? That's something that I'm not sure helps me feel good with the whole idea of punishment and reward, because the punishment comes for something way back. So what do I learn from this thing? I learned that even if I do find a punishment, it doesn't work in the way that us people usually think. It works in much longer time spans. much greater. It's not that I did something specific and now I'm going to get punished. I can be suffering now because of something that happened way back, which is hard for me to grasp, to understand. But it gives me a different understanding about how the world works. It doesn't work from now to now. It doesn't work from one moment to the next, but our whole span, our whole scope is much greater. Things are at much are a much larger scale. I'm a very small part of a very, very, very big story. So when I look at things that happen nowadays and I'm looking for significance, the chances of me knowing exactly what God meant by this virus are very, very slim. Because even if I know that there's a punishment for a sin, it isn't necessarily in our times or in the generation before. It can be many generations ago that just now things are being worked through and coming down to this world. But I also think that Ramban, because it's a hard notion and concept to think that we're going to be punished for something that happened so many years ago, I think that many people's real thought is that, you know what? God gave us Brit Ben Abitalim really and essentially to tell us, you don't have to look for a reason. You don't have to see what it was in the past that causes the hardships for now. The hardships aren't necessarily explained by a certain sin. Dafka is a fact that God tells us about it so many years before, says don't look in just the immediate past for a reasoning. And the fact that God himself chose not to give a reason says you don't even have to look for a reasoning. So what do we do in such a world? We're back to chaos, right? What do we do? There's so many things going on in the world and we're looking for significance. We're looking to give it some meaning. And then I come and tell you, you know what? Brit Ben Abitalim tells us, don't look for a meaning. You don't have to explain it with a sin. You don't have to say that it happened because of A, B, or C. Especially not when you're just trying to prove what you always knew all along. So we're back to chaos. So we're back to what? So there's no significance? But there is, because with the story of Egypt, God said this is going to happen, which means it has some kind of significance. There is a reason. You might not understand it, but there is a reason, but it's really part of a very big story. But another thing that we can take from this is that God only also says, you know what, this is going to happen, but afterwards it's going to be good. Meaning the focus isn't necessarily on what happened to cause a hardship, but what are we going to gain out of this hardship? So in Brit Ben Abitalim itself, God talks about and also coming back to the land of Israel. Meaning, in Brit Ben Abitalim, God says you should know what's going to happen, but mainly not for the time of the hardship, but so you have something to look forward to at the end of the hardship. You need to go through the hardship not thinking of why did this happen, but what are the promises that are going to come and be fulfilled after this happened, or consequently, right? And I think that this is a very important message. First of all, it helps us understand that the story of Eov is not just a fable. God says you don't always have to look for the sin. It's always good, by the way. It's always good to think to yourself, what can I do differently? It's a good time for cheshbon nefesh. It's a good time to think about what you're doing, but not such a good time to tell other people what they're doing wrong. It's a good time to think for yourself. But besides thinking to yourself, what can I do better? What maybe I did that should be fixed? Okay, because it's a time for thinking. God sent us to a room to think hard for a long time. But besides that, maybe the focus and the significance in this world of chaos and turmoil is not saying why did this happen, but what did this happen for? If we go to, again, back to Nechama Leibovich, she says that the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is utilized throughout the Tanakh for being better people. For example, וגר לא תונה ולא תלחצנו, כי גרים הייתם בארץ מצרים. The fact that we went through such an experience makes sure, or is supposed to be used, so that we don't suppress the stranger. Okay? We're supposed to take our experience to understand better other people, to understand better the way the world works. For example, in Vayikra, we just read it in the parsha a couple weeks ago, והארץ לא תימכר לצמיתות, כי לי הארץ, כי גרים ותושבים אתם עמדי. The idea of being strangers in the land, we take from Egypt to the land of Israel. Don't ever feel too much balabite. Don't ever feel like you own everything. Keep this feeling. Cherish the experience of being strangers in the land. And also we have the commandment of Shabbat. שמור את יום השבת לקדשו כאשר ציווך השם אלוקיך, 6 ימים תעבוד ועשית כל מלאכתך, ויום השביעי שבת להשם אלוקיך לא תעשה כל מלאכה, אתה ובנך וביתך, ועבדך ואמתך ושורך וחמורך וכל בהמתך וגרך אשר בשעריך, למען ינוח עבדך ואמתך כמוך. וזכרת כי עבד היית בארץ מצרים, הוציאך השם אלוהיך משם ביד חזקה ובזרוע נטויה, על כן ציווך השם אלוהיך לעשות את יום השבת. Meaning, we have two reasons for Shabbos in the Tanakh. One is to remember how God created the land. But the other is, you should rest. You should remember how hard it is to be a slave in Egypt. And therefore you should rest, and you should also make sure that your slaves, your male slaves, your female slaves, that they should also be able to rest. Because you have this experience in your past. So the idea is that when we look at things that we're going through hardships, we're going through hard times, we're going through special times. We can try to focus on the past and say, why did this happen to us? Now, again, I'm all for personal conclusions of how to become better people and to look back and think, what have we been doing wrong? Always a good idea, and this especially is a good time. But it's also good to not only dwell in the hardship and say, wow, this means we're really bad people. This means other people were really bad people. It's better to try to take this as an experience that's supposed to teach us something, that's supposed to take us on another level, that says, God says, there are certain experiences that you are going to have to go through. In the end, it's going to be good. It might take some time. And it doesn't help those people who just became enslaved to know that in 200 years, their descendants are going to have a lot of money and leave the land of Egypt. Or maybe it does help them. It helps them to know that in the end, something is going to be good. Something good is going to come out of this. We get a larger scope, a bigger time span, and being part of something very large. But also it says we should try to go through an experience, not always thinking about the past, but with a very big emphasis on the future. And this, of course, connects us to what we said about our religion. One very big part of our religion as the idea of memory. The memory, commemorating the things that we go through in order to take out of them whatever significance we can to become better people in the future. And one last point I want to take out of this, and that is that, as we said, a lot of times things are going to happen in the world, things are going to happen to the people of Israel that we don't have control over. Okay? This was preordained. 400 years before people of Israel left Egypt, God already said that this is what's going to happen. We don't always have the ability to affect how things are going to happen. We don't get to decide that they're going to be the hardships. We don't get to decide that in the end it's going to be good. What we can decide is what we're going to make out of it. And if we go back to the story of Exodus, we see that this is one of the things that arises throughout the plagues. And this happens in the plague of Barad. Before the Barad, Moshe stands in front of Pharaoh and says this, הנני ממטיר כעת מחר ברד כבד מאוד, אשר לא היה חמור במצרים למיום היווסדה ועד עתה. So tomorrow there's going to be such a heavy hail, such as not been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. ועתה, שלח העז את מקנך ואת כל אשר לך בשדה, כל האדם והבהמה אשר יימצא בשדה ולא יאסף הביתה, וירד עליהם הברד ומתו. Meaning, Moshe is giving them a tip. You know what? There's going to be hail tomorrow. An idea. How about you take into the house all your livestock, everything you have open and out in the open, you should bring into the shelter, and then when the hail comes down, nothing will happen to them. And lo and behold, what happened? הירד דבר השם מעבדי פרעה, הניס את עבדיו ואת מקנהו על הבתים. Those among Pharaoh's courtiers who feared God's word, they brought their slaves and livestock indoors to the safety. לאשר זה שם ליבו אל דבר השם, ויעזוב את עבדיו ואת מקנהו בשדה. Those who paid no regard left out their slaves and livestock. So, what do we see from here? Moshe is giving here information that the people can decide if they're taking responsibility over the information that they got. The big stories are not going to be able to affect. They can't decide if there's going to be hail or not going to be hail. But they can listen to the hints and decide to be responsible to what happens to their own fate. To decide that they can be God-fearing and listen to what's going on and do what they can to make things better. And really, in the next story, right afterwards, in the Arbe, Moshe and Aaron come again to Pharaoh, ויבוא משה ואהרון אל פרעה, ויאמרו אליו, כה אמר השם אלוהי העברים, עד מתי מאנת לענות מפני, שלח עמי ויעבדוני. So Moshe and Aaron come and say, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may worship me. כי מאן אתה לשלח את עמי, הנני מביא מחר הרבה בגבוליך. If you don't let my people go, I will bring locusts. What happens next? ויאמרו עבדי פרעה אליו, עד מתי יהיה זה לנו למוקש? שלח את האנשים ויעבדו את השם אלוהיהם. הטרם תדע כי עבדה מצרים. Pharaoh's courtiers, they go through something. They're changing throughout this process. They're understanding that there's a connection between fearing God and what's happening to them. Now, they themselves aren't necessarily going to change the course of action, but they're changing their attitude. They're changing the ways they treat the situation and say, maybe we can take action and try to at least make things a little lesser, not as worse, not as bad as they could be. So we do have here another message to take through this, and that is the idea of responsibility. Again, we can't be responsible for everything. We can't be responsible for knowing why God did things. And sometimes it's not a certain thing in our past, which is why God does things. Sometimes it's an experience that God wants us to go through. Could be a very, very hard experience. I am not talking about much greater questions and much greater hardships that the Jewish people have gone through in recent generations and previous generations. I'm talking now about something that's even small relatively, but we're going through it and it's hard for us. And that is something going over the Jewish people especially. How do you deal with such a thing? And if I'd like to summarize it up, I want to say it's teaching us humility. It's teaching us to be humble. We don't always know why God did things, and we can't always pinpoint the sins. But what we can do is try to make this experience count. Take this experience to become better people. Take this experience to, again, besides humility, to learn compassion, to learn responsibility, to learn that even in our religion, what we think is right is not always what's right. Sometimes we need to listen to what God wants from us right now. People, fighting over opening shuls when what the right thing was to do was to close the shuls. Because sometimes you need to say, God decides for us how to worship him and what to do right now. What is a religious thing that is demanded of us right now, even if our gut feeling is different or we're used to something different. And to try to take responsibility over these things and see how we can learn from this experience to become better people. So in the great scheme of chaos, in this great turmoil, what we decide to take out of it is what will give significance and order and meaning to everything we're going through. Thank you for listening. And that's it. Thank you for Nishmat, for the opportunity to teach you all wonderful people.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Adina. I want to tell everyone that this series will continue next week with Rabbi Dr. Hananya Blas, and he will be speaking about how to confront chaos and turmoil, Avraham versus Noach in the writings of Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. If anyone has questions or comments for Rabbanit Adina, you're welcome to stay on. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful week.